Everywhere in the world is urbanizing, right? The small towns are disappearing, evaporating, everyone's moving to the cities. And so if you're stuck, so to speak, in a small, isolated community, and there's very little to do and no economic future and very little hope, and a fragmented community because so many people have left, high rates of poverty and single families and multi-generational histories of alcoholism and so forth, then you set the stage for nihilism and suicide. And so that's where I would look first. The idea that these smaller communities are viable is just simply not the case. We don't know how to make them viable, and so sustaining them as if they could be viable isn't a helpful option in my estimation.
What do we need to do in the field of education to give people more of a purpose?
Well, I mean, that was the point of the humanities education, right? It was to produce citizens, and citizens weren't consumers and they weren't workers. They were people who were, at least in principle, trained to be proper, sovereign representatives of the state. And so great literature, great art, anything that, religious stories, classical education, intense study of history, anything that gives people an association with the past and what people could be and how they've gone wrong and what they've done right is a way of building character. And I mean, there are other ways of doing that too. I think sports are often a very good way of building character, competitive sports in particular, if they're regulated properly, and that focus on characterological development is an absolutely appropriate part of a general education process. And I think that that's fallen by the wayside for all sorts of reasons. So that's left. And then I also think that boys in particular are increasingly actively discouraged because the fundamental axiom, the unshakable belief of the radical left is that the West is an unquenchably oppressive patriarchy, and what that implies is that that's the fault of men, and what that implies is that any males, whether they're young or relatively young or older, who are ambitious and who desire to take their place, in the uppermost reaches of various hierarchies of authority, are actually contributing to the despoiling of the planet and the fundamental oppression of women and minorities. And I think almost all of that is complete nonsense. I don't know how many people, it's certainly hundreds, tell me that watching my videos and listening to the podcast particularly has stopped them from committing suicide because they were so nihilistic and so hopeless and also so convinced in some sense that human activity in itself was evil and destructive, and that if they had an ambition or desired to take part in the world, that was actually an indication of some moral flaw on their part, when the contrary is there couldn't be anything less true than that. It's a form of extraordinarily destructive anti-truth, and it's very, very hard at the moment, particularly on young men and not so young men.
What's your advice to women?
Oh, it's the same as it is for men. I mean, I never wrote the book for young men. I never made my lectures for young men. I think part of what happened is that YouTube is 80% young men. And so there was that initial baseline phenomena that drove it. I do think that young men might find what I'm saying more necessary at the moment than young women do, because I think young women are encouraged in multiple dimensions in ways that young men aren't. And the stories that I've been telling are just as applicable to young women as they are to young men. I mean, for my entire academic career, the overwhelming majority of my students were women. It ranged from 70-30 to 80-20 as the years went by. And so there was never any reason to assume that this was a message that was specifically targeted to one sex.